Well, welcome everyone to our New York Preservation Archive Project Coffee Break Chat. It is great to see everyone out there. And if, by chance, you happen to have your coffee handy, this being a coffee break chat, I would like to propose a toast to the Gargoyle Hunters. Cheers. Well, my name is Brad Vogel, and while I am seemingly hovering here just outside the tower of the Woolworth Building, I am not a gargoyle. I am your host for our Coffee Break series, which is brought to you by CTA Architects PC, so thank you so much for your support. But we have a really fun program lined up for you today. And as you know, for those of you who have joined us before, these are less like presentations and more like conversations. We have two great conversationalists today to make that happen. And I'm really excited because we have Gina Pollara, who is a board member of the New York Preservation Archive Project here to guide our conversation. But before I go into her bio, I wanted to talk a little bit about what is the New York Preservation Archive Project. We, in essence, are all about finding ways to save and tell the stories of preservation in New York City. Because with things like the Woolworth Building, things like your favorite historic neighborhood, they don't just save themselves. People have to actively work, and in many cases, drive away for decades even, to save the places that matter most and that you love and that really give New York its sense of itself. So we pride ourselves on our work because through oral histories and saving papers that are about to be tossed in a dumpster somewhere, it takes a lot of different types of work to capture these stories. So today, we have a program that lifts up a very interesting part of that preservation story and ties in more than just one building and more than just one neighborhood, and really looks at one interesting character in particular. But you'll hear more about that. So for now, Gina, what can I tell you about Gina Pollara? Someone who I have come to know over the years. Gina is an architect, an author, and an urban designer. She's formerly the executive director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Four Freedoms Park and a former president of the Municipal Art Society. She has also been involved with the Two Bridges Neighborhood Council and the Cooper Union Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture Archive. Gina, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to see everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm excited to be talking with John about his book. And John is a native New Yorker and a longtime contributor to the New York Times. He has a streetscapes column there, but we're not going to talk about that today because I really want to focus on his book. He is a graduate of Yale University and received his MFA in writing from Sarah Lawrence. So John, I guess the first thing would be to just give us a brief overview of your book for those people who have not yet read it.
Oh yeah, sure. The book, it's a novel, The Gargoyle Hunters. It takes place in 1974, 1975, kind of one of the naders. I used to say the nadir, but we're at a new one now of New York's history. It's about 13-year-old Griffin Watts, who is caught between two parents in the aftermath of a really nasty divorce. And he wants more than anything just to become closer to his estranged father. Griffin lives in a brownstone on East 89th between Lex and 3rd. His father has moved down to this remote neighborhood no one's ever heard of called Tribeca, where he lives in a warehouse piled high with salvage. And so Griffin allows himself to be recruited into his father's illicit and extremely dangerous architectural salvage business. Griffin's father takes advantage of him, really. Griffin is very small and nimble. So his father sends him clambering around all the tops of all sorts of New York City buildings, iconic skyscrapers like the Woolworth Building that you see behind Brad's head, as well as unsung tenements and so forth, specifically to steal right off the facades of the buildings their exuberantly expressive architectural sculpture, so terracotta castings, stone carvings, that sort of thing. And what I you know, the Preservation Archive Project is about history, and my book is about history, but the book is a novel, and novels are meaningless to me. And frankly, architecture is only meaningful to me in how it, how people live in it, around it, interact with it. So the characters were very important to me, but I wanted to tell both a small, intimate story of a fragmenting family during the early 70s in New York City, but I also wanted to tell a big story about New York City's near death in that 1974, 1975 period where we nearly defaulted on our debt. So the whole book takes place, it's a run-up to that famous Daily News headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead."
So did the idea for the book come after your interest in sort of the built environment of New York, or did your interest in that get sparked by the idea for the book? Sort of the chicken and the egg, which came first?
Well, I've always had a deep interest in the built environment of New York. I mean, I just think it's because that's the environment I grew up in, and New York was a grittier place in the 70s, early 80s. I imagine if I'd grown up in the country, I might have been fascinated with trees or running rivers or that sort of thing. But in my environment, we didn't have mountains; we had buildings. And in addition, just briefly, my mother is a painter and a wonderful painter of lost streetscapes of New York. So I was growing up, and she would paint these large paintings, and our Jill Gill is her name, and her paintings covered the walls of our home. And what she would always do, starting in the early 50s, is paint the buildings that were about to be torn down, so whole streetscapes that were about to be lost right before the wrecking ball took them. So I grew up with the streets of lost New York all around me, and the 57th Street automat was still serving up cheesecake in the kitchen, and the 3rd Avenue L was still clattering down the front hall. So I grew up with this idea of New York City as a kind of palimpsest that has the other city, the previous cities, layered just beneath the current city.
So it's really in your DNA. Couldn't escape that. I think that's what's so wonderful for me in this book is all of the places that you mentioned that I remember. I mean, I'm not a native New Yorker, but I've been here since 1984. And so there's a lot of places that you mentioned that I, remember and recall. And I also like that you open your book with this idea that we all have our own individual New York, that, the New York and the things that you remember, or the events that you recall when you walk by a particular building or a particular spot in New York aren't the same as mine. And that is so true. And it seems truer about New York than any other city, I feel. But maybe I'm just particularly attached to this place. So there are so many real people and real places that show up in the book. And I'm curious, about the research that you did that informed the characters in the book.
Well, if you're talking about specifically the characters, and this does, again, there's sort of the strand, there's the architectural history strand, which is the sort of, archival and oral history component, and then there's the characters. And both of those strands are taken up with the real life figure of Ivan Karp, who we can talk about. I do want to say at the outset that this book is not about Ivan Karp. He's not the inspiration for it or anything. But he ended up becoming a crucial source for the book. So basically, I started out with this father character who is obsessed with saving the lost city. I mean, part of the background here, right, is that in the late 19th, early 20th century, starting in the late 19th century, we had gifted stone carvers pouring into America, New York, from Europe, and then they would go around, and even on humble buildings like row houses and tenements, they would sort of incise their imaginations into our streetscape. And they really turned our buildings, our city, into a kind of really vivid public art gallery. So that happened in the sort of flowering of architectural creativity in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then you get into the post-war period where it's less is more and modernism is king, and block after block of these things are being torn down. And at that time, this fellow, Ivan Karp, recognized that how much of New Yorkers' architectural patrimony was really being lost and dumped in dumpsters and in landfill. And so there's this sort of, this is cart before the horse as far as my novel goes, because I that's the research I did later. But I'm a little distracted by Brad's machinations here on the screen. I apologize. What happened, so the telling story really is that Ivan Karp is walking down the street around 1950, and he's a Brooklyn boy from Flatbush. He's self-educated. He's never went to college. He's walking down the street, and he sees a beautiful terracotta cherub at his feet that's been cast there by wreckers who had no regard for its beauty. And he picks it up and he takes it home and he puts it on his kitchen table and he says to himself, my God, this must be going on all over the city. And of course it was. We were losing thousands of buildings, or hundreds of buildings, but thousands of architectural sculptures almost daily. So Ivan gathered together a group of friends, and they ended up calling themselves, they became a formal nonprofit. They called themselves the Anonymous Recovery Society. And he would lead these clandestine raids on demolition sites to rescue these sculptures from the landfill of buildings that were just about to be torn down. And so and they called it Anonymous Arts, really, because he said of all of the sculptures he saved, and he saved something like 1,500 of them, he never once saw a signature on these sculptures. So in homage to these unsung artisans, he named his group after them. So I knew distantly of Ivan's existence, but he was not the inspiration for the book. And so I started outlining the book. I wrote 6 or 7 chapters up until the father and son were just about to go gargoyle hunting. And then I said to myself, my God, I don't know anything about gargoyle hunting. I don't know how terracotta was installed in the late 19th century in buildings, or how you would extricate it as a salvager. And the same with, there's a cast iron strand of the book, same thing there. So that's when I got in touch with Ivan Karp, because wanted to use the tools of journalism to talk to people who really had done this, so that it would really, the book always had, in my mind, it always had some rather almost larger than life moments in it. And so I thought it was extra important to anchor my flights of fancy in fact. So the nuts and bolts of how architectural salvage really took place. And so that Ivan was invaluable for that.
So you did not know of Ivan Karp until after you started working on the book?
I knew of his existence, right? Again, because of my mother, there was sort of this ambient knowledge about the palimpsest of New York. And then I knew like, it's one of these things, like, you know, your mom tells you just these things a million times and you're not really listening until you're ready to listen. I think she had told me over the years that this fellow had rescued these things and they were behind the Brooklyn Museum, but it didn't register. That wasn't the impetus for the book at all. You know, these things serve both. The book is about fragmentation. It's about the fragmentation of the city, and it's about the fragmentation of the family. The way the novelist's mind works is different from how the journalist's mind works, even if it's the same guy. So I started out with the family, and then the point where I got really excited about the book was when I realized that it was quite natural, it was quite organic to have the fragmentation of the family echoed in the literal streetscape. But then I, as a New Yorker and as a journalist, I really wanted to make it ring true. So I really did rigorous research.
So were you able to actually interview Ivan himself? Because I know he passed away in 2012.
Oh yeah, so what happened is, I went up to visit him in Charlottesville, where he had sort of an artist community that he was the center of in upstate New York, and visited with him and his wife. And he would take me, and I ended up learning so much about this. It had not been my intention, but I ended up writing a feature for The Atlantic about Ivan Karp and all this history that I've just been touching on of architectural sculpture in New York. So Ivan, so Ivan would gave me the facts about it, but he also, again, I just want to say the character is really not, the father character actually as a person is not like Ivan in very many ways, other than his fascination with art and the streetscape.
Right.
But Ivan had an emotional engagement and attachment to the art, which I think he actually did with all art. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure many of you do know, Ivan ended up becoming a very famous art dealer. He popularized Andy Warhol and some of the other pop artists. And he just had a feel and a love for art and its place in a culture when things were bubbling up to the surface in different eras. So pop art at that time, but then earlier. So he said that's why he had this eye, that he understood that these, even without any training when he was a young man, he understood just from looking at them that these architectural sculptures represented a certain ferment in the late 19th century and a flowering of energy and artistic endeavor that had never really happened in certainly in America in a concentrated way, and certainly never has since nobody loves ornament anymore.
He reminds me very much of the Chicago photographer Richard Nichols, who, like Ivan Karp, salvaged so many pieces of buildings in Chicago. A lot of Louis Sullivan, and
Right.
and similarly removed pieces off the building, and actually ended up dying in the Chicago Stock Exchange because the building collapsed on him. So it was a super dangerous pursuit to hunt for gargoyles, and I think you capture the sort of danger of that really, really nicely in your book. I'm also curious. Oh, so go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Zoom is terrible. I am interrupting you, and I apologize. But also, Zoom the audio doesn't allow you to talk at the same time. I just wanted to jump in to say the thing I was trying to get across that I sort of lost my train of thought on Ivan was, so Ivan, though the character is not Ivan, there were a couple of moments, and one of my favorite lines in the book, it was spoken to me by Ivan. I didn't write it, which was, he was showing me around in Charlottesville. By the way, he had a museum of these in Charlottesville. He had collected a bunch of them, and with they restored an 1850s General Store, he and his wife. And there's this little jewel box of a museum in the middle of cow country, in the middle of nowhere, is the most beautiful display of New York City architectural sculpture in the world. But he took me down to the grotto where he had all of his material, all of the stuff that he didn't have room to display. And he would walk along and poke. He was 83 at this time. He was a very intense, wonderful man. He would poke his cane and he said, "Oh, she looks Persian," or "He looks Gallic. He must have been someone that Caesar came into contact with." And then at one point he got very quiet and emotional and said, I think about these carvers who came over from Europe. He said the bridge of time is very poignant. I think of these carvers who came over from Europe and carved these things, and I meet them across time. And I thought that was very beautiful, because another element of this actually is we can all still do that. I mean, one of Ivan's conceptions about all this was that, if you research the history of that period, of the carving period, most of the carvings you still see around New York on buildings were typical designs, often taken from handbooks of ornaments. So you would carve an Athena or a Moses or something. But what Ivan realized was the most valuable ones around New York, they are not designed. I mean, I actually looked into the history of this. Most of the carvings that unless it's an architect designed, a serious firm like McKim, Mead and White, the buildings from that period when the architects did the buildings, they did not design the ornament. So they would just, on a keystone, they'd write carving, or a spandrel, they'd just write carving. So the carver would trot up to the building site, and the foreman would say, "Give me a Moses," and he'd point to the block of the keystone there. And so the carver had free reign to carve whatever the hell they wanted. So a lot of the time they got bored of carving Athena and Diana and Moses, and they would start to just carve their buddies or the local cop or their girlfriend or so forth. So when you walk around New York City and look up at these keystones on tenements, if you see an oddball looking face, particularly the brownstone carvings, the ones that are carvings as opposed to terracotta castings, in all likelihood, you are looking at your forebears. You're looking at New Yorkers who lived in your city 140 years ago.
That's amazing.
And sorry to jump in, Gina. John, I just shared one of the photos that you had provided of the Keystone Portraits.
Yeah.
And let me just try to share again. Zoom is being Zoom and didn't seem to want to share earlier, but let's see what we can do here.
John, does the museum still exist?
His museum still exists. His wonderful wife, Marilyn Gelfman Karp, was an NYU professor, and she helped build it with him, and she still, I think, keeps it open in the summer, except not during plagues.
Right.
All
So,
right. Gina, are you seeing the image right now, or are you just seeing the background?
I'm just seeing your laptop, your desktop.
yeah, I'm just seeing like your files.
Okay. I'm not sure why it's not sharing today, but I will send them out via the chat for people to download. So as we're talking, you can take a look.
So you opened your book with the family going to a marsh in New Jersey. I think it's the Meadowlands. I've never been. It's where the debris from Penn Station was dumped.
Right.
Have you actually been?
Well, no, but I mean, I think they built the entertainment complex there.
No, it doesn't exist anymore. I wasn't sure. I don't know if anybody knows. We can get to
Well,
that.
no, it's the Caucasus Meadows. I mean, that's another thing. I'm glad you asked me that. That prologue, which is really dreamlike, because it's the recollections of a drowsy 4 or 5-year-old boy remembered from 45 years later when he's 50. That was inspired by things that Ivan Karp and Marilyn Karp told me, because they used to go, and nobody knew where they were dumping the wreckage of Penn Station. As you know, there were protests. It was controversial that they were tearing it down at all. And Ivan, through whatever methods, whatever charm or palm greasing he employed, found out that they were transporting this great civic masterpiece, the Camden White Penn Station, and dumping it in the Secaucus Meadows in New Jersey. So that's the New Jersey Meadowlands. So he and his wife and friends used to go and picnic on the ruins of Penn Station in the mid-60s. And so that's where and he said you'd see an arm poking up, or and things would be burning and so forth. So it was very evocative to me. And he said to me, the direct answer to your question is, he was very old at this point. He said, well, yeah, he said, I can take you there sometime. You take a left at the slaughterhouse. So that's why I have a slaughterhouse. And that's all he told me. And the rest, it sparked my imagination. And I described the slaughterhouse from the perspective of a 4-year-old in the middle of the night going there.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of that spot from many people over the years, and was always very curious about it. Unlike when Chicago dismantled the Garrick Theater, Richard Nichols and his fellow scavengers put everything out in the Navy Pier and let people come and take fragments of the building as a way to sort of preserve the building. And I wonder if any of that at all was done at Penn Station, because I believe that one of the eagles that belonged to Penn Station actually was in front of the old engineering building of Cooper Union. At least that was what we were told that the eagle that was there came from Penn Station. So
There's
I'm wondering.
yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just, go ahead.
There is a diaspora of the material, and there's some wonderful websites that have tracked these things. There's a website that is devoted almost entirely to tracking the eagles of Penn Station. But Ivan actually worked with the Brooklyn Museum. He found and with this, I think it was the same wreckers actually that had dumped the stuff there. They were called Lipset, and they were out of New Jersey. And he managed to get the Brooklyn Museum to take possession of one of the giant. So there's a lot of ornament around, but the most impressive ones, there's a couple of stunning carvings that would flank there were 4 clocks on Penn Station, one on each of the 4 faces, and the clocks were flanked by 2 Adolf Weinman carvings, sculptures. One was day and one was night, because it was a train station that operated 24/7. And night is this very beautiful, so day has a, daylight is perky, day is perky and has a sunflower and maybe some other symbolism. Night is languorous, she's got a droopy poppy seed, she's half undressed, she's very sexy. And she now resides in back of the Brooklyn Museum across the street from where I live. I go visit her all the time. And she's enormous, she's
I've seen all of those in the parking lot back there. It's really amazing.
They have a column also from Penn Station. It's not much to look at because they just have 2 sections of the shaft part, the bottom and the top, and they put them on one on top of the others. The proportions are all wrong, so it looks very odd.
I also am wondering if, how intimately, how much you knew about Bogatas before the book, or was that also something that you came to in your research?
Well, so James Bogatas was, as you know, a cast iron innovator in America, and designed these various systems for creating cast iron facades out of different modules, modular building that would allow you to create really ornate facades out of cast iron they were really meant to simulate stone. They would actually put sand in the paint to make it look like stone, and then they would paint them over. But what I knew about Bogatas, and this was one of the it was part of the almost initial conception of the book, was so that I'm sure many of you know, but there was a famous building that we called the Bogatas building. It was also called the Lang Stores, which was built in 1849. It's right north of where the World Trade Center was. And what I knew was this, at the time, well, there was a scandal. There's an architectural heist that was front page news of the New York Times in 1974, but that by the time I was writing this book, I'd never heard of, none of my friends had ever heard of, all my native New Yorker friends. But in the 1970s, when the Washington Street Urban Renewal Project was happening, they raised most of Western Tribeca, and they raised a whole section around, to make way for the World Trade Center. The Landmarks Preservation Commission was very new at that time. They were only created in '65. So this is a couple years later. The Landmarks Commission went around and figured out which buildings in the area that was about to be raised were worthy of salvaging. And they saved some federal buildings that they moved up to Harris Street. They're still there, but they also saved this Bogatas building. And what they did is, so it was a cast iron front. These cast iron facades were designed, it's like an erector set. They're little pieces that are all bolted together, thousands of little pieces, the biggest jigsaw puzzle in the world. And they got a Columbia professor and his students to do measured drawings and carefully draw and document how the building was put together, with the idea that it would be put back together. So they deconstructed it and they were going to put it back together. So Landmarks Commission has this thing deconstructed. They drop it in a lot on Chambers Street, between Chambers and Reed Street on the West Side Highway. It's middle of nowhere. Plus the whole building, that whole area has now been raised. So they put this precious I think it was the oldest cast iron building in America at the time. It was certainly the oldest, the oldest Bogatas building. And they left it and it just looked like a bunch of junk, a bunch of iron. And the building got stolen. They actually, some scrap, people stole it and sold it for scrap metal they found it at a scrapyard in the Bronx. So I knew that story. That was front page news in 1974. I knew that that was going to be the climactic moment in my story, and that I wanted, nobody knows what happened to that building, who stole it or why. There were a couple of people who were arrested. It's a very long story that I compressed in the book and I want to compress now, but the building was stolen. The pieces were tracked to Hunts Point scrapyard. The city then reclaimed, there was maybe a third of them left, the original building, but with a cast iron building, because it's modular, if you have enough of each representative piece, you can cast new ones. So they wanted to recast the building. It's a landmark, for Christ's sake. And then they hid it in Hell's Kitchen in a housing department building, and then it got stolen again. And nobody knows what the hell happened to that building. So long story short, or long story long, because I'm rambling here, I wanted to tell what happened to that, who stole that building, what happened to it. So that was, I started actually with that image in my head, and I don't want to give it away, but what happens to that building after it's stolen is a very big moment in this book. And I had that image in my head almost as a dream before I knew any of it, before I thought about Ivan Karp, before I knew the book would have anything to do with gargoyle hunting.
Did Ivan have any insight into who stole the building?
No, I didn't. I'm not sure I ever even discussed that with him. I'm not sure Ivan, I'm not sure how much he knew about cast iron, although he did have a beautiful cast iron face on the outside of his O.K. Harris gallery in Soho, and he called her Ms. Harris. O.K. Harris was a fictional character he'd invented anyway, and he called her Ms. Harris.
Very nice. John, just to jump in here, I did just post in the chat a link to our oral history with Beverly Moss Spat, who was the LPC chair at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Great. So talk a little bit about the Woolworth Building, because that also is a big character in this book.
Right. So again, with that, I sort of, the way the novelist's brain works, I had an image in my head before I did the research. I had a picture, I had a story. I knew I wanted the father and son to be clambering around on the top of the Woolworth Building, trying to steal a gargoyle off the top of the building. But other than the general sense that we kind of all know that the Woolworth Building is a Gothic revival building, and so it's Gothic and it's church-like, there must be some gargoyles up there. I didn't really know where they were or how to find them or how to describe them. So I found, and I'll just say I was obsessed with that building because my sister and her husband have an antique frame gallery in Tribeca called Gill and Magodich, and their loft is on Duane Street. And Simeon Magodich, my brother-in-law, did a beautiful painting of the Woolworth Building, the view from his Tribeca loft. And I used to do when I was in graduate school, I did antique frame restoration out of that loft. So I would sort of commune with that building every day. So I had the idea in my head that way. But of course, it's a real building, and you can't just make up details about it. I guess you could, but as a journalist and a New Yorker, I didn't want to make up the details. And I wanted that scene to be as realistic and detailed as possible, so that if even somebody who knew the Woolworth Building like the back of their hand would say, yes, that could have happened the way he described it. And so I found a preservation architect who actually was up and down on scaffolds on the outside of the Woolworth Building in the 1970s when they did a massive restoration. And I called him up, and I just cold called him. And I was sort of, my fantasy was that maybe he would have a snapshot or two that I could use as reference. So I talked to him for a while, and I said, do you have a snapshot? Do you have anything to show what it looked like? Because you know, when you're writing fiction, you've got to really describe every nook and cranny of the thing, at least the way I write. And so I asked him, do you have a snapshot or two? He said, you know, John, as a matter of fact, I have an entire PowerPoint presentation of how we did the restoration in the 1970s, full of archival photographs from that period. Every little detail close up, and I would be happy to share it with you. So he did that, and then he did an amazing thing for me. It was an amazing gift for a novelist. So I have all those photographs. But then when I wrote up my description, I interviewed him. Like I called him and I said, well, how would they get up there? And I interviewed him the way a journalist would. And I said, okay, I got these guys. I got a father and son. How would we get in? He said, well, you'd break in, you'd go up. I guess you'd climb out the window on the 54th floor, and then there's this ledge. And he gave me all this detail. And then when I wrote it up, and I said, well, how would you get up there? He said, I guess if you're clever, you could throw a rope up and you might, you know. But then a lot of it was my imagination. But I wrote up this very detailed, very active. See, I mean, there's I can give something away. Someone falls off the building in the course of this scene. And so I wrote up a draft of that, and I actually sent it to him to see if there was anything that was not credible to someone who knew the building that well. And so I vetted it with him. He thought it all worked. Except I remember the one detail he said that wasn't realistic was that I think I had the kid being belayed on a kind of harness off of a pulley system, kind of block and tackle situation. And he said, you know, we didn't have 5-point harnesses back then. It was basically a glorified belt with canvas and a D-ring on the back. So I made that change.
Yes, I really appreciate all the detail that you have in your book, and I encourage everybody to read it for that reason, because it really does give you a lot of insight, and it feels very accurate. So the one thing that I personally connected with as well is that at late in the book, you quote the architect Kahn talking about the joint as the beginning of ornament, and
Right.
Having spent a good almost 10 years of my life realizing the FDR memorial on the south point of Roosevelt Island, my heart kind of jumped when I read that. So I really appreciated that that shout out to one of my favorite architects.
Well, that was one of the little hidden treasures that what do you call it? Like little egg that I hid for people like you, because I don't think I said that it was Louis Kahn. I think I just.
No, you
I
don't.
had him quoted. He said, "Oh, an architect I know, or an architect I heard."
Yeah, exactly. No, you don't attribute it. I don't know, Brad, do you want to open it up to questions?
Yes, I think that sounds great
Or
right
John,
now.
if there's anything that you want to say that we didn't cover?
No, but there's just one thing that occurred to me before, and I love the detail of it. You mentioned Louis Sullivan in Chicago, and we're talking about Ivan Karp. Well, there's only one Louis Sullivan building in New York City, and it's the Bayard, I don't know how to pronounce it, Condite building in NoHo. And actually, Ivan rescued, so that's, you know, full of this incredible terracotta, I think probably the best in the city.
Yep.
And Ivan actually rescued, they were tearing down one of the owners was tearing down these capitals off the columns, and he salvaged 6 or 7 of them. And years later, and this is a real trend, it was the only Louis Sullivan building in New York City. It's a major building. And I guess it hadn't been landmarked at that time. I don't know the history of that. But so years later, Ivan's wife, Marilyn Karp, is doing an art history lecture at NYU. And she tells about the tragedy of this building being partially stripped and how they salvaged these pieces. And a girl comes up, or a young woman who's in college comes up at the end and says, you know, that's my dad. My dad owns that building, and he did that. And what they ended up doing was they wanted to restore the capitals, but they were gone. So they went to Ivan, who had the original one, and they cast them off of that. So it is now restored in a way that it could not possibly have been if Ivan had not restored them. And there's actually 5 or 6 of those Louis Sullivan capitals pinned, sort of affixed to the back of the Brooklyn Museum. They look very odd. I mean, they're out of place, but if you know what they are, it's a nice curiosity.
It's fantastic. I mean, we owe so much to Ivan and Richard Nichols and others who, you know, had the wherewithal to sort of see the beauty and the importance of, you know, salvaging and saving this and how it can be used as a resource.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We have a question from Gregory Dietrich. So Gregory, I'm going to unmute you now and feel free to fire away with your question.
Hi, I just wondered if you know what became of Karp's personal collection of architectural ornament.
Sure, yeah. They're all still up there at the Anonymous Arts Museum in Charlottesville, New York. And normally on weekends, when there's not a plague on, you can go up. I forget, it's a drive, it's 3 or 4 hours. But you can go up and see them on the weekend, roughly from Memorial Day to Labor Day. I don't, you know, you would want to check ahead of time because Marilyn's getting on in years, so I don't know if by next year she's still going to be doing that. But they're all there. Or actually, that's his personal collection. And I mean, there's a much bigger subject here that I'm not sure we want to get into, but he did donate ultimately 1,500 of these pieces. Well, he's rescued 15. He donated about 400 of them to the Brooklyn Museum, which under its previous management treated them pretty poorly. But so there is a sort of refugee camp, fenced refugee camp behind the Brooklyn Museum, where you can still see a number of these ornaments that have been, they're literally for 20 years, they've been lying on their backs with their faces exposed to the elements and really quite damaged.
I know you can see them out the window when you're in the museum. When you look.
Yeah, well, there's some on display, but there used to be, starting in the mid-60s, 66, the wonderful Brooklyn Museum director, Thomas Buechner, at the time, what basically happened was Ivan was just a guy from Flatbush. And all these architectural ornaments were piling up in the backs of these kids. They were early 20s, but in their parents' backyards. The parents finally said, you know, get these the hell out. So he dumped them. You know, that's a picture that I took a couple years ago.
Wow.
He put the Brooklyn Museum agreed to take these items in the 60s, and Thomas Buechner, the museum director, created a gorgeous sculpture garden that the Brooklyn Museum then tore down in the year 2000 to expand its parking lot. And they put some back, but it's a pale shadow of what was there before. But the one thing that I want to get across is what Buechner said to me when I was writing that Atlantic feature. I said, well, why did you think that these items, these carvings off of humble buildings like tenements and row houses, because most of them are off of humble buildings in this collection, why did you think they were worthy of a permanent exhibit in a major museum? And he said, that's like asking me why I think Rembrandt's a good painter.
Very nice. Before we go on to a few additional questions, John, since we now have the images up here, I just whipped together a quick little document as an alternative. Let's take a quick jump through and just to give people a minute sense of what each image is.
Okay, so that's, I assume you want me to ramble over the top of this?
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay, that's Ivan Karp. The one wonderful thing about Ivan and his crowd at the Anonymous Arts Recovery Society, and it sounds all glorified and fancy, but it was just him and whichever friends he could wake up on a Sunday. And I interviewed some of the friends who were still alive as well. I mean, Ivan was only one of several people I interviewed. And they said Ivan was such a little, intense little guy that he'd wake you up and he'd say, we're gonna find treasure. And they would go out hunting. But they didn't document any of it. They just were piling it up in backyards. So actually, my mother took this photograph in 1962. This is a site, I think it was St. James Place, just north of the Brooklyn Bridge, which I think is now public housing. And this is pretty typical story for New York. So in that period during urban renewal, all these tenements were torn down for hideous high-rise public housing projects. But they took so few pictures of any of themselves that actually when Ivan died a couple of years ago, I sent his wife this photograph that my mother had taken, and they didn't have it. They actually used this very photo in the memorial booklet because they didn't have any other photos of this sort of preservation hero in action. I have another one with you where he's got a a jackhammer or a, yeah, he's tearing the hell out of a spandrel or a facade to get at a spandrel.
Very nice.
These are two pieces in Ivan. These are Ivan's. This is Ivan's loft on West Broadway. Both these guys are in my book. I put them in the book because I thought they were so wonderful. These are fabulous examples of what I was talking about before, about how the carvers would sometimes just carve oddball characters that they knew. This is clearly not Zeus or Moses, right? This guy looks like, one guy looks like he has a toothache and the other guy looks like he got punched in the eye in a barroom brawl. And so they're more major artworks in a way because that was Ivan's conception, because they are one of a kind. A lot of, terracotta is mass produced, so sometimes you'll see a terracotta piece and there'll be many more around town that look like it, but those are one of a kind.
Now, what is this, John?
This was given to me, this was in the PowerPoint presentation I was telling you about the restoration of the Woolworth Building in the 70s. The Woolworth Building, the real restoration took place in the late 70s. I moved it earlier for novelistic reasons, so that it would coincide with, basically with the Bogatas theft that I wanted to write about. So Timothy Allenbrook was the project manager, or he ended up being the assistant project manager. He's the preservation architect who sort of fact-checked my imagination I was talking about before. Mm-hmm. So remember, when I started this, I thought, oh, there must be gargoyles up there. And so I rather randomly call this guy and I say, are there gargoyles up there? And he says, not only are there gargoyles at the top of the Woolworth Building, John, but I own one. At the end of the project manager gave him one of these gargoyles. And this is it. This is a picture from the late 70s in the Woolworth Restoration Office. And I love it because of the can of tab he's drinking there and the old rotary phone. It really dates him.
That is one terrifying gargoyle, I have to say.
Well, the one thing I'll say, I'll try to be brief, which as you can see, I'm not very good at. But one thing that this is a piece of actual original research that came out of talking to him, and this went directly into the novel as well, is when I started talking to him about the restoration of the top of the Woolworth Building, he told me something that I had never seen reported anywhere until I did a couple of years ago, that the Woolworth Company, I don't want to diss them, they put a lot of money into restoring the Woolworth Building in the late 70s, but the top of the building was the most ornate. These tourelles, these 4 towers at the top of the building were so ornate that it was going to be very hard to replicate the terracotta, so they actually just clad the whole thing in aluminum siding. So to this day, there is aluminum siding at the top of the Woolworth Building, and you can see it from the street. So I thought that was perfect for my obsessive preservationist thief father character, that he would be outraged by this and that he would want to climb up there and steal the last gargoyle before it was stripped of the building. So that's how I found something real and then fictionalized it.
Okay. We have a question here from One Helen Chin. Helen, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, John. It's a question I've been meaning to ask both you and your mother, Jill Gill, for ages. Chances are you've gotten this question multiple times. And throughout all the work you've done in terms of urban relic hunt or rescuing, is there one item that both you or your mother have been looking for? You know it exists, but you just have not been able to find it yet.
Other than the Declaration of Independence, there's no, the other copy that no one knows about. There's no particular item that I've been hunting for. I'm sorry, I wish I had a better answer. But I do have a gargoyle collection, and in fact, one of them I bought I have a carved, it looks like Zeus or something, face from who spent about 100 years, bearded fellow, over a doorway in Harlem and many others. And I bought one actually at auction from that had been on a tenement in Brooklyn for over 100 years. And I put it in my car, and it was, this one actually was terracotta. And she was in my car and the car got stolen. I was driving her around. So somewhere there's a real, there's another current day gargoyle hunter. And then oddly, the next year, the the car was found and the gargoyle was still in the back. So I retained it. I have her again in my living room.
Do you know what your mother would like to find?
She's there if she wants to talk. I don't know if she wants to. She's here with us.
Let me see if I can make that happen. One moment here.
She's never used Zoom before, so she may not be familiar with the idea of talking back.
Well, as you know, John, I'm a huge fan of your mother's work. I mean, the thing is, I remember when we first met, I fangirled, embarrassed myself to how much I respect her work.
Jill, would you like to chime in?
Have I unmuted?
You are unmuted. Yes, go right ahead.
Oh, okay. I would say in answer that it's not a matter of looking for a relic. It's find whatever you find. It's just the treasure of the discovery of everything. And this is the first time I've ever talked on Zoom. I'm a dinosaur on computers.
Doing great.
So anyway, did that answer your question?
Yes, you did.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
my house is filled with fragments, of brownstone fragments too. And I have one head that was a cornerstone in a basement store that was a gargoyle, my only gargoyle. And I wouldn't buy any. I just used to get them.
And actually,
take my daughter out of take my daughter out of her stroller and have workmen put fragments into the stroller so I could get them home. And it was just a little old plastic stroller and not in very good shape, but Tracy's legs are very strong. All that.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jill.
Actually, if I can chime in here, one really interesting thing that I'm sure that we've never discussed publicly, it just seems right for this crowd. So Margot Gale, who is, the great cast iron scholar of New York, was a pal of my mom's, and my mom actually has on her wall in her bedroom a cast iron spandrel, very ornate, very florid, with a head of a sort of a Medusa head. And I actually talked about it with Margot Gale. I was a kid. I wasn't interested in any of this stuff at all, but somehow she was in the house and I got talking to her. And she said she was looking at it and she was comparing it to her own book, and she was convinced, and if you look at them side by side, you will be too, that piece was salvaged by a friend of my mom's from the Brooklyn waterfront, right?
I think so.
Yeah, but it's a twin of some of the spandrels from the stolen Bogatas building.
Ah.
So yeah, it goes over two
while
windows.
I was writing the book, that my own mother had this very object in her bedroom.
Okay. Thank you again, Jill, for joining us. I really appreciate it, and happy inaugural Zoom to you.
Yes, thank you. It wasn't so bad. The face is so bad, but the experience is good.
All right. We have another question here from Mitchell Grubler, and then we may have time for one more question, and we'll wrap things up. Mitchell, if you want to unmute yourself, go right ahead. Or I can unmute you as well. 1 second.
Would you know if the Brooklyn Museum is still accepting architectural fragments?
Well, the last thing I would presume to do is to speak for the Brooklyn Museum, but how do I say this gently? If they were, I would not recommend donating them there until they demonstrate that they're going to take good care of them, because they have many hundreds that are not on display is one thing, because most museums, big museums, have many things that are not on display, most of their collections, in fact. But they, as I say, there are any number of artifacts in a fenced refugee camp behind the Brooklyn Museum that have been exposed to the elements for 2 decades. So I doubt it, because they don't seem to have an active interest, but you never know. I still am quite hopeful that this new administration there will take they're very talented people, and I hope they take an interest in this collection and give it the attention it deserves, and the care it deserves.
All right. Well, thanks again to both Gina and to John. The winner, let me just take a look here of the copy of the book, The Gargoyle Hunters, goes to Sarah Eccles. So congratulations, Sarah. And at this point, I'm actually going to, just on the off chance that you enjoyed what you saw today, unmute everyone. So if you're inclined, you can clap.
The messages. And so,
So thank you once again, Gina.
oh, I don't know. So then I
John,
just
we
recorded a
appreciate
new
it.
temporary message.
Great.
Thank you. It was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much,
Brad.
Thank you, Gina.
Thanks,
Yes.
John. Thanks, Brad. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Right.
Take care.
I'm gonna try to calm down now. You know, it's like one of those